All right, so when we're looking at this right here, I'm going to go through the specific functions of those two main cell types: Sertoli, sustentacular nurse, Leydig interstitial. So Sertoli cells right here, again, not only, so these are the Sertoli cells over here. You can see that they form the structure, so then meiosis can occur and sperm can be produced. Now, besides forming the structural component, so meiosis can occur, so sperm can develop, it also forms the blood-testis barrier. And keep in mind, our sperm cells completely look different than any other cell in our body. So it's going to have different, absolutely, completely different type of receptors compared to other cells in our body. Even the chromosome numbers are different. So the chromosomes in a sperm cell, you only have 23 chromosomes. In a normal cell, obviously you have 46. So it's going to look, the sperm cell itself, completely alien to any other cell in our body. If we didn't have this blood-testis barrier, our white blood cells will migrate to this region and will destroy all of our stem cells. Now, in some autoimmune diseases in males, that does happen, though it is uncommon. Sertoli cells, like we mentioned, also provide support and development of sperm cells as they undergo meiosis. They produce inhibin, which inhibits more FSH, which then causes a negative feedback protein, right? It produces in a negative feedback effect. Again, you want to produce as much sperm as you can. At the same time, if you overproduce, you're wasting a lot of energy making that excess sperm cell. And then the last thing it does, produces androgen binding protein, which then combines with testosterone and stimulates these spermatogonia to undergo meiosis. So that is, lots of different functions of the Sertoli cells right there. Now, again, the interstitial cells are back here, and the interstitial cells are, so here's one seminiferous tubule, a second seminiferous tubule, and then a third seminiferous tubule. You're going to have interstitial cells found in the interstitial space between the seminiferous tubules. These are the cells that releases testosterone with the release of LH, Now, again, right, for spermatogenesis, right, this kind of reinforces, and it talks about when crossing over occurs, when DNA replication occurs, and that occurs, remember, DNA replication occurs right here, right, where you have a 46 chromosome, 2N cell. It has to undergo the cell life cycle. So it's got to go to G1, then S, G2, and then split. So as it goes to G2, and the S phase, DNA replication occurs. Then you start undergoing the meiotic cycles, where it's prophase, metaphase, anaphase. But instead, that is called prophase, anaphase 1, telophase 1, metaphase 1, and then you split to form secondary spermatocytes, which then splits to form the spermatotids. Just a rough going over it again. And again, right, keep in mind that in terms of the male and the female, all males, and we hear, it's kind of crazy that throughout recorded history, women who are married to powerful men, and back then, it was a truly patriarchal society where men were in full control. Obviously, it's good that things are starting to change. And what's going to be seen is that even now, in certain areas of the world, boys are more wanted than girls. It's incredibly sad. But in certain cultures, like my culture, Chinese, Indonesian culture, what happens is in China, because of the one-child policy, which got kind of amended a few years ago, but up until then, anybody that wanted to have kids, you can have more than one child, but only one of those kids will be fully funded by the government, meaning they'll have their education paid for. They're part of the state health plan, all that other stuff in China. Now, if you're super rich in China, you can have more than one child, but it's up to you to pay for everything else. Most people in China can't afford it. So they only had one child. And what we see then as a result? You saw a lot of Asian Chinese girls being kind of, adopted by American parents that wanted to have kids. It's beautiful. I love that there's so many Americans that are willing to adopt kids like that. The thing is, a lot of the kids that are getting adopted are almost always all girls, Chinese girls. Now, like I mentioned in my class the other day, when I had, my daughter was in school and she goes to a private school. So in terms of category, it's, a little bit more affluent. The demographics are usually more white people there, Caucasians. And she had, and she, even still now, has 4 friends that are Chinese girls, and every single one of them have 2 white parents, right? I've never seen a Chinese boy, usually with, adopted white Caucasian parents. It's almost always Chinese girls. And the issue we're going to see now is that, in China, right, you're going to have a lot more guys, right, than girls. Remember, it should be about 50-50. Now, in China, can you imagine if it's 52% guys, 48% girls? That doesn't sound like a big difference until you multiply it by 1 billion people. So you're going to have hundreds of millions of guys that don't have girlfriends, that have time on their hands to cause issues. Now, why am I mentioning this with spermatogenesis? Simple, right? It is the male sperm that is the fundamental cause of having either a boy or a girl, right? Meaning, cause sounds a little bit different, but what I want to mean is this, right? Due to meiosis, with meiosis, we can either have sperm with X chromosomes or sperm with Y chromosomes. If a Y chromosome sperm is going to fertilize the egg, now you have an XY boy that's a fetus. If you have an X chromosome sperm and that fertilizes an egg, you're going to have an XX female. That's going to be the fetus. It is, the mom can only give X chromosomes. So women are XX, right? And because women are XX, what happens is that you have the chance, you have 2 X chromosomes. If one X chromosome is bad, you can turn it off, right? Now, because you have 2 X chromosomes, you can only give the X chromosome to the baby. Dads can have X or Y sperms. If the Y sperm penetrates and fertilizes, then the Y chromosome sperm cell will fertilize the egg, and now you have an XY baby. 50% of male sperm is X, 50% is Y. There should be a 50-50 mix. Guess what? We know there's a slight difference in the way X and Y sperm slightly move. And in areas like China, India, where still a highly patriarchal society, they have found that they can kind of tell the difference between X and Y sperm by the usage of magnets. And they can do and use magnets and separate the Y and the X sperm now. And you can target that sperm, so then you can have in vitro fertilization. You can imagine if this becomes widespread, it's not good, right? It's already 51.5%, and I believe it's 51.49% right now, right? That's the actual percentage of guys to girls in China, all right? In India, even, where it's still highly patriarchal. Well, guess what, right? There are scientists that actually do this, where they separate out the sperm cells and then use only the Y sperm to fertilize the egg in vitro. All right, spermiogenesis, spermiation. Spermiogenesis is a maturation of spermatotids into sperm cells. So what we're going to see is we have the spermatotids being formed right here. It's then going to turn into sperm cells or spermatozoa, right? So this spermiogenesis occurs in the seminiferous tubules before the sperm cells get released into the epididymis, right? Spermiation is the release of the sperm cell so that it's no longer attached to the sustenticular cells anymore. It allows then the sperm cell to migrate to the epididymis, where it will form an acrosome so that it can penetrate through the egg. Now let's take a look at this sperm morphology. Then we'll take a look at the effects of hormones, right? Sperm morphology right here. The sperm is adapted for reaching the egg and then penetrating and fertilizing the egg. Now, remember, and we'll talk about it next time, when we talk about how an egg is ovulated. When an egg is ovulated, the ovulated egg goes into the fallopian tube, but there are other surrounding cells that migrate with that ovulated egg. In other words, it's not just an egg that gets released and that's it. You'll have instead lots of other cells that surrounds the egg that gets released with it. You'll actually have another round of even gel-like corona radiata that actually will then also follow the egg. So for a sperm to actually fertilize the egg, it has to work its way through multiple layers of cells and then go through a gel-like membrane and then somehow get through into the plasma membrane. And then you can fertilize the egg. So there are a lot of obstacles a sperm cell must go through and penetrate through before it can even go through the plasma membrane of the oocyte and then penetrate and then fertilize. Now the sole point of sperm cells right there, right, and its penetration into the egg is to allow the head of the sperm to enter the cytoplasm of the oocyte or egg. Now, what we're going to see is that you're going to have nuclear DNA right here. The nuclear DNA is found in the head region, and it's 22 autonomic or 22 chromosomes along with an X or a Y chromosome, right? Now, you have an acrosome region that develops in the epididymis. The acrosome region contains lots of hyaluronidase and proteinase enzymes that allows the head of the sperm cell to work its way through all the obstacles of the oocyte to penetrate through the plasma membrane of the oocyte as well. Then you have a tail region of a sperm cell. Now, the tail region is where we're going to see a functional flagellum and lots of mitochondria. The mitochondria is going to drive the flagellum movement, so then the sperm can kind of work its way up the uterus into the fallopian tube. Now, big picture thing right here. In early 201, we talked about the organelles. We said that the mitochondria produces ATP because that's where all the enzymes for the Krebs cycles are found. That's where electron transport occurs, right? It also, mitochondria, has its own DNA. In other words, the DNA, the genetic material to make mitochondria is not found in our nuclear DNA, right? Only mitochondrial DNA is found in the mitochondria, right? The DNA that we have in the nucleus that we just formed, right, in the, that we just made by meiosis, that nuclear DNA here, the 23 chromosomes, it does not code for a single mitochondria. So the mitochondria for the sperm is found in this tail region. The only way a mitochondria from dad can enter and be found in baby is if this tail region enters the egg, right? So we always say that mitochondria that we have are all inherited from our mothers. We should not have mitochondria from dad. Here's why. When a sperm cell penetrates that oocyte and it fertilizes, only this head region penetrates through. Since this tail region never penetrates, none of the mitochondria ever enters the oocyte. So what happens? All of our mitochondria only comes from that oocyte that has its own mitochondria. The mitochondria from dad never enters into the egg. Because of that, none of our mitochondria here is used and is found in the baby, right? These are just crazy, right? We produce about 300 million sperm cells every day. And the crazy thing is that life expectancy of 48 hours within the sexual reproductive system of females. Now we're going to talk later on about just some of the cool things that happens to increase the probability of birth, of fertilization. All right, now we kind of mentioned this, so I'm going to skip through it and again another picture of this. You might see something like this on the exam, right? And this kind of explains what's occurring. So we mentioned it on the previous lecture. So review, right? I'm going to highlight it so you know I would ask all of this right here. Know what these hormones do. Know how they're inhibited from each other, how they activate each other, all right? So GnRH, LH, FSH. I want you to be able to know these really well. So then it should make sense in what they do in males and later on in females. Right, now, let's go through the new material here. Hormonal effects of testosterone. The big thing that is different, we know you have testosterone release at puberty, but from birth to puberty, there's very little testosterone. The funny thing is, pre-birth, as a 2 to 3 month old fetus, we will see the release of testosterone. So you see testosterone being released prenatally. And what it allows us to do, right, is to have the male reproductive ducts being produced. What do I mean? Simple. When we are first conceived in utero, we'll either have an XX female that contains ovaries or an XY male that contain now testes. Now, the weird thing is we have 2 sets of ducts though. So if you're a male and you have testes, you have 2 sets of ducts gestationally in utero. If you're female, you have ovaries, you also have 2 sets of ducts, right? One set of ducts called the Wolffian duct is going to then turn into the male reproductive tract. Is it turn into the ducts, the Wolffian ducts will turn into the vas deferens. It turn into the seminal vesicles. It'll turn into the prostate gland. So it becomes the male reproductive ductal system. The other set of duct is called the Malarian duct. And that is going to turn into the female reproductive tract, right? So again, you either have ovaries or testes, but you have 2 versions of ducts. That's true for males and females. One version of the ducts is going to turn into the male reproductive tract, which is your vas deferens, your seminal vesicles, your prostate. For females, you have a second set of ducts called the Malarian ducts that will turn into the fallopian tube, that will turn into the uterus and the cervix, right? So all of those ducts, those 2 ducts, will eventually turn into either the female or male reproductive ductal system. But at gestation, like early on in gestation, we have both sets, right? So it doesn't matter if you have testes, doesn't matter if you have ovaries. When you first conceive, you have both sets of ducts. Then what happens? Early on in the start of the first trimester, right? So really on, we say about 6 to 8 weeks, there's a release of testosterone. The release of testosterone occurs really early in gestation. And it's only released if you have an XY person, right? That XY male is going to have a Y chromosome that has a specific gene that allows for testosterone release really early on in gestation. And what happens then with the release of testosterone? It causes the male genitalia and the male Wolffian ducts to develop. It also causes the female Malarian ducts to die and undergo atresia. And it kind of makes sense. Now we have testes and we have the vas deferens, we have the seminal vesicles, we have the prostate that develops with the testes, right? And it's all due to the release of testosterone. Now, there are other kind of hormones we'll talk about in 29 that gets released that helps the female Malarian ducts to die off, right? But it's the release of testosterone that causes the male ducts to grow and to then, be seen later on. Now, females don't have the Y chromosome. Because females don't have the Y chromosome, you don't have the release of testosterone. No release of testosterone causes the male Wolffian ducts to die off. The Malarian ducts then will develop in the absence of testosterone. The female ducts, the Malarian ducts, will occur as a genetic default. If there's any problem with testosterone in the males, you might have the female duct develop. So now we might have testes as well as a fallopian tube-like structure, right? Now, we also will see testosterone release at puberty. And then we kind of mentioned before, that will cause the secondary sexual characteristics that we see, the deepening of the voice, the increased male metabolism, which allows you to have increased muscle growth and increased sexual, right, behavior and libido. So again, testosterone release really early on in gestation, allowing the male ducts, the Wolffian ducts to develop. Then it goes quiet for about 13 years. And then at about 12, 13 years of age, you will have testosterone release again, and this will be the cause of puberty. Inhibin. Now, inhibin is a lot more important in the female reproductive system. In the males, it's going to inhibit the release of FSH right here, right? But that's about it. Sperm production is sufficient. When you produce enough viable sperm, Sertoli cells release inhibin. Inhibin then inhibits the release of more FSH from the pituitary gland. So this is a negative feedback system that allows us to then kind of regulate how much sperm we produce. So it's a negative feedback loop. Let's see what happens in this negative feedback loop. So let's see, you're producing enough viable sperm. Your Sertoli cells releases inhibin. Inhibin then inhibits the release of FSH. So then your sperm rate of production decreases. What happens then? Well, now you're producing less sperm and less sperm. Well, eventually there's such a small population that you no longer have inhibition. You no longer have inhibin being released. When that happens, FSH is released to stimulate more sperm cells being produced. Now, the rest of this is just kind of discussing the anatomy. I'm just going to skip and go into the prostate and the accessory glands, right? Now, the cool thing about this is, again, trying to imagine how, if you were, trying to figure out a way to increase the likelihood of having babies, what are the ways that can increase that probability, right? So we're going to see in the seminal vesicles, it produces 20% of the seminal fluid. And most importantly, right, it secretes, and secretion contains fibrinogen. Yes, that same fibrinogen that we saw in the clotting factors cascade, that fibrinogen is also found as part of our seminal secretion. Why? Well, what we're going to see is, along with having an erection, erection means that the opening of the penis, right? The orifice, the ejaculatory duct not the duct, but the opening where the urethral opening is, right? When you have an erection and you have the movement that we see with sexual reproduction, what occurs? Well, you basically put that opening right next to the cervix, right? Right next to the opening of the uterus. So when there's ejaculation, you can have all the sperm along with the seminal fluid concentrated at the opening of the cervix. The opening of the cervix then usually slightly open during ovulation. What happens? Well, fibrinogen activates. As fibrinogen activates, fibrin causes all the sperm cells to clot right at that entrance of the uterus that we call the cervix, right? So now we have all the sperm cells right next to the door that leads to the opening of the cervix, that leads to the uterus. Perfect, right? It's like Black Friday. You have all those people back in the day trying to get into the store so that they can get the best deals, right? As soon as you open the door, all those people rush in. So that's what's going to happen in terms of our reproductive system. You have ejaculation, and all the sperm cells are going to be found right at the opening. To make sure they're all concentrated in the opening, fibrin is activated. Fibrin throws a net and catches all the sperm cells, so then they are forced to be at that opening of the cervix. Now you've concentrated the region so that all the sperm cells are at that region. The weird thing is this, right? You've concentrated it, but having all those cells there does us no good if we don't lyse it and have the cells migrate up. So the prostate gland secretes the remaining 30% of the seminal fluid, is going to contain high pH, clotting factors, and this is a big one, fibrinolysin, right? So not only do we have a clotting factor that activates, that allows us to concentrate all the sperm cells at the opening of the cervix, we also have a lytic factor that destroys the clots. So then once we have concentrated all the sperm cells there, what we'll do then is lyse the clotting factors, and it allows the sperm cells to migrate up in large concentrations into the uterus and then up the fallopian tubes. Again, everything here to increase the probability of reproduction. It's pretty cool. The bulbourethral gland contributes about 5%, gives us a mucus secretion and seen just before ejaculation. Notice how all of this has higher pH, allowing the sperm cell to then survive in the slightly acidic environment that we see in the female vagina. Again, everything to increase probability of having a baby. All right, I will stop right here and we'll talk